Truth Frequency Radio Network. KTFRN. Worldwide.
Welcome, Shadowland Voyagers. In the spirit of sovereignty and self-empowerment, we invite you to journey with us into the Shadowland. Let's rediscover, reclaim, and integrate the fragmented aspects of our individual and collectively held consciousness. Realize true freedom and restore authentic expression. Could it be the only way out is through the Shadowland? Welcome, everyone. This is Sienna Leah with Shadowland Voyagers, and we are on episode 22 with Beth Green, Living with Reality. Christina, good evening.
Good evening, Sienna. Good evening, everyone.
And Elizabeth, good evening to you.
Good evening, Sienna. Good evening, everyone.
All right, we are all on board. We have an absolute master of conscious transformation with us. I've studied to some extent with Beth Green. She feels like a deep soul sister, an extraordinarily talented intuitive that is bringing pristine, step-by-step information in the transmutation from where we are in an ego-driven state to a paradigm that is truly motivated by our higher aspects for the highest good of all. Her work is so well developed. She's done this for a lifetime. So I'm going to read a little bit of, you know what, I'm not going to read this. I'm going to ask you, Beth, just jump into your life story in the first half hour. It's such an extraordinary journey that you've taken. I would love you to share that with us, Beth.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Well, there are a number of factors that run through my life, and which you will find over and over. One is a overdeveloped sense of social consciousness that I seem to have been born with. I mean, my mother reports that I was lecturing people on their spiritual attitudes when I was 5 years old. And the other is extremely poor health, which I was also born with. And they go hand in hand, and they shape my story tremendously. But just to give you a little bit of a background, I was born in New York City in 1945, so that dates me, early in 1945. And I came out of World War II, and those of you who are in our age group know how much that impacted us. And I think some of that sense of social consciousness came because we were living in that era where there was a sense of right and wrong, and the good guys and the bad guys. And also being from a Jewish heritage, I was very aware of the Holocaust and the horrors of prejudice and what they did to people. And I think somehow the mix of all of that came through me at a very early age, because I was extremely distressed by seeing any form of racism or injustice, and was extremely upset by the pain, the needless pain that we have caused one another. And as a young woman, I turned to a political focus because it was the only thing that I knew. I did not grow up in a religious family, just a traditional one, but there was not any real God in that family. And beyond that, I had very strong feelings about the world and the pain of the world, and I could not allow for there to be a God of a world that looked like this. And early in my
Yes.
life, I decided that if there were a God, I would have to hate him. And so I chose to become an atheist. But I was always a mystic, if you understand what I mean.
Yes, we do here.
Because it to be connected to source, as it is, I think, for all of us. And simultaneously, when I was very, very young, I was weak and sick and couldn't do a lot of things on the physical plane. So I really did not have a normal childhood in any way. I was at home reading books, practicing the piano, and just not capable of doing physical things. In fact, playing the piano was a little bit too hard for me. I became activated even to a greater degree after another health crisis. When I was 15, I got rheumatic fever. And at that time, they really didn't know how to treat it. They did the best they could, but it destroyed my health. The treatments destroyed my health. And I spent the next year and a half in bed or on a chair. And I think that also promoted a great introspective quality.
Yes.
Because I had no friends anyway. I was such a bizarre child. I didn't have any friends. And then by this time, I was completely physically cut off from everybody and just sat in the house all the time. And that was my junior and senior year of high school. So I ended up not going to school most of my, the last years of high school. And so I was very isolated from the thinking of my peers. I never got along with children anyway. I'm going way into this. It's really surprising me what's coming out of my mouth, but I think I'm really trying to say something, but I'll find out what it is.
Fine. We have time for this, and we all felt attuned to really hear your story today. So you just take all the time that you need.
Well, thank you, because as I'm saying this, I'm realizing things about myself. So this is very helpful. It's that I was very different from other children. I didn't have any children as friends, even as a child. I only spoke to adults. But I think that all of that isolation not only made me introspective, but made me somehow freed up from so many of the concerns of the people of my own generation at that time, because I didn't live in their world. I lived in my own world. And so by the time I was 16, I wrote a letter to the New York Times and did not tell my parents. And it was about the bomb. And I never expected it to be printed. It was a plea from a 16-year-old girl to our world to look at the fear that we are creating by, this threat of nuclear war. And I did something I was not supposed to do because I wasn't allowed to walk or take a shower or do anything for that year and a half. But I walked to the mailbox thinking that I was going to die because they told me that if I did anything physical that I would die. So but for the cause, you see, I was willing to walk to the mailbox, which was at the corner of our street, and walked back and didn't tell anyone. I knew I was going to get yelled at for having left the house. But and somehow or other, by taking, these scholastic aptitude tests, I managed to do very well and got into an elite college. At the age of 16, I was a freshman. That was a disaster. I went to Smith College, which was a girls' school, and it was like an Ivy League school for girls. And at that time, back in 1961, it was very, very conservative, and you were judged harshly by slicing your lemon the wrong way. And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we did not have any money. We were very poor. And but we had the culture, as many Jewish families push their kids. I learned classical music. That was before I got rheumatic fever and I couldn't play the piano anymore. So I had that, but it was like going to Mars. Being in this place where girls were throwing their cashmere sweaters on the floor and had taken a year off from school in order to travel the world with their parents. It was a little bit outside my league. And also we had to say Christian prayers before every meal. I was in a state of shock, but wasn't used to anti-Semitism. And the other thing I wasn't used to is I was not used to women being second-class citizens because in our family, women and men were equal. And it was a shock to go out into the larger world and discover that that wasn't true. So there were many shocks for me, including people saying anti-Semitic things right in front of my face because they didn't know I was Jewish. So all of this just reinforced the same energy in me about the injustice in the world class. I began to realize there really was a ruling class, an upper class. And it made me more and more radical, actually. As it happens, my letter to the New York Times was published and made an international splash, which is how I found out that it was published, because somebody called my parents and said, "Is this your daughter?" From Belrose, New York. And so then I had the experience of receiving letters from all over the world of people who had been touched, and that was such a profound experience because I could feel that through the word you could reach people that you didn't even know existed. Yes. And find relations, the people who cared about the things that you cared about, you could find them out in the world. And of course now we have the miracle of the internet, which has taken that to such a high degree, and your program is one of them, ways of reaching to our relations around the world and how that network is growing. And I did have that experience. I was also expelled from college. I told them I had to leave the school one class early in order to go to a demonstration at the White House. We picketed the White House. It was ban the bomb. And they warned me that I would be severely punished, and I was. Anyway, it was a long story, but I did end up being expelled. And that was shocking to me also because injustice made me just royal. But on top of that, I was extremely ill. And it was very, very difficult for me to function, anywhere and to do anything. And they were out to get me. The scholarship office was trying to get me to come back the next year with a scholarship, and the dean was trying to expel me. So it was a very interesting experience. Anyway, the result of all of that was that I came out of that very confused and also feeling the isolation, that I had that sense of elation, because the reason that I ended up in that demonstration is some students contacted me. There were 14 people marching around the White House, and I was one of them, and I got on the front page of the New York Times again. So that was not what my parents or Smith College were looking for. But you see, I had the experience of how fantastic it is to connect to people. But then I had the experience after I was expelled that nobody would help me. And my parents were desperately trying to get the school to, they said that I was expelled for infringement of academic regulations, which implied that I was cheating. And they said they would make sure I never got into another college. And there was a hole in the support system. There was no support system to follow up. And I know other people have had these experiences. I'm not saying these are the worst things that ever happened to anyone. But that put me into a shock and a real identity crisis about what was I going to do and who was I. Long story, marriage and all that kind of nonsense, which, marriage, divorce. But ultimately, and I would say that by 1963, I started to come back to political thinking because the war in Vietnam was beginning to ramp up. And there were people who were talking about it, and it just intuitively felt wrong. And then I studied about it, and ultimately in 1965, I started to work full-time for the movement. And I had not ever finished college at that point, and worked for the National Committee for a Sane Nuclear Policy, which was part of the spearhead of the anti-war movement at the time. And got to participate in the first Madison Square Garden rally against the war in Vietnam because I worked for SANE, and SANE was, spearheading that. And then from there, I went to work for, and I say I went to work for, I mean, I actually got a measly paycheck, and that was how I made a living working for the movement, and got to see the left from the inside, you see. And I saw the sectarianism and all the ego and all the fear and wanting to look okay and not be associated with communists and so on. There was a lot of anti-communism and communist hysteria in the nation at the time, having come through the McCarthy period. And by the way, seeing McCarthy on television made me more of a radical than anything else. Seeing the witch hunts and seeing people arrested for having ideas that were different, and all of those things pushed me into a very radical stance because I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. So where that all took me was ultimately I went back to school full-time and worked part-time, and thank God New York City had free college. And I was able to finish and ended up, getting a scholarship to go to Cornell for graduate school. But at that point, I was studying Latin American history. And I know that, Sienna, you're in Ecuador. I was very, very involved in, at that point, the Third World revolutionary movement and becoming aware of what was happening internationally and in South Africa and so on, all of which just kept feeding this anger in me about the injustice, and I did not know what to do except to be angry and organize. And so I that's what I did, and ultimately I became one of the leaders of a women's movement organization called Wages for Housework, which was really about giving women power by acknowledging the tremendous contribution that women make, not only in our nation, but throughout the Third World, that is unpaid. And the powerlessness of women because women didn't have their own money. So I was the West Coast coordinator of the Wages for Housework campaign, ended up in California and started doing a lot of radio. And that was unpaid, by the way. A lot of my, all the political activism except those couple of years was volunteer. But simultaneously, and I also was in Cleveland in a workplace organizing collective. I was trying to overthrow the phone company, as well as the government, and was active in the union movement of trying to radicalize the union movement. Every one of these experiences brought me into direct contact with different levels of the society. I myself became so disabled because my health was so bad that at the age of 29, I was given Social Security disability because I was just totally incapacitated, completely and totally incapacitated physically, and only my mind operated, and that only occasionally. I had an opportunity to be just about everywhere and to be able to understand people, really get, I think on some deep level, the oneness. The only people that were left, of course, were the white men, you see, because I could have compassion for white women because they were women. But even white men I was able to have compassion for if they were working class men. So as a left organized, there was just the only them that was left was the rich white men. But that changed when I ended up having a psychic awakening, a spiritual awakening, and I started to see into their hearts. And then I saw that everyone is the same, and that we all have the same needs and the same aspirations and the need to be loved and to be valued, and that we all had the same problems, and that alcoholism ran through the poor and the rich, and self-doubt and despair. And I began to work with people, from other classes. And then myself, I owned a house. And for the first time, I understood people's fear about the value of their homes going down. And so every experience brought me closer and closer and closer to the oneness, to being in everybody's moccasins. It is so important. The major shift between the Beth, who was the political activist, to the Beth who had the spiritual awakening in 1978 when I had a psychic awakening in 1980, but I had a spiritual awakening in 1978 when I got involved with an alcoholic. And by the way, I was also raped at knife point. And I lived in horrible neighborhoods. I lived in tenements a lot of my younger life. And I mean, as a young adult and a not so young adult, I know poverty from the inside. I've lived with a black man. I know racism. I've, been around, I've traveled a bit around the world, and somehow or other, before I became totally ill, I was in Chile when Allende was president. I think that the biggest difference between the pre-spiritual awakening me and the having had the spiritual awakening me is not the passion for its change, which I still have, and not that inner drive that is still with me, but my understanding of the oneness has grown, and the oneness not just on an energetic spiritual plane, which I can feel because I feel energies and I can feel God. But beyond that, just as the living so many different experiences and being with so many different kinds of people and counseling people who have embezzled and people who molested children. And I feel it, the unity, what connects humanity is our collective pain.
Yeah. So you've lived every ounce of what you teach in the world.
Every ounce of what I teach, the bad marriages, the beatings, and all of it.
Do you see a purpose to this pain that humanity all experiences?
It's a beautiful question. On a good day, yes. What I see is that the world is that we are not individuals. And this is a teaching that I received when I had my psychic awakening and started getting direct contact with the other side. I was taught very early, and I started to channel God in 1978. But in 1980, I had this psychic awakening, and I began to hear these inner guides in a very powerful and palpable way. And at that time, I was so confused about who I was, because remember, I was the left-wing organizer and an atheist, and suddenly I'm channeling discarnate spirits, It's very weird. And I had no background, and I was channeling what they call the ascended masters, and I didn't even know there were ascended masters, But they came into my inner world and kind of introduced themselves to me. And what they taught me very early was that when I asked the question, who am I? Because I couldn't figure out who I was. And they said to me, look at the stream. And I looked in the stream, and they said, you are the drop of water that is different from all the rest. And I said, what drop of water is different? I don't see a drop of water that's different from all the rest. And that they said, that's the point. There isn't any, that we are all one. And that from that, I began to understand that we are all part of the oneness in the process of evolution. And that pain is our way of noticing there is an imbalance, an misalignment, and that there's a change needed. The purpose of pain is awareness. If you didn't have pain, you would walk on a broken leg and never realize that you were damaging yourself. It is through our pain that we realize the damage of our way of being. And at the same time, because we are oneness and we are all aspects and of God, there is no shame in that, because it is really God that is evolving. And that's another piece of the story that happened in the very early 1980s, when I had a tremendous experience with God, where I felt God in a way that I never had before. And I saw light, and all was very, very, the 10 Commandments worthy. It could be a movie. But anyway, God said to me at the end of the conversation, remember, Beth, God is changing. And I said, I don't get it. You know, I thought I had just started believing in God, and I had an old-fashioned version of God. And I said, that doesn't make sense to me. I don't get it. And God said, well, are you a part of me? And I said, yes. And he said, well, are you changing? And I said, yes. He said, so, well, if you are me and you are changing, how could I not be changing?
That must have been such a huge revelatory moment for you, and it must have just completely shifted your reality. How did that change your life?
It set me on the course that I'm still on, which is that God is not about healing us. We are about healing God. That is healing in the sense that we would think of it as healing. It's really about the evolution of God and not about the evolution of Beth Green. Because when you put together those two pieces of the first guidance that I got, that I was a drop of water in the stream and no different, that I was an aspect of the whole, that helped me to understand that I don't really exist as an individual, although on some level I experience myself that way, but it is more like a cell in the body of God is an individual cell, and it can die. But its existence, its meaning, its purpose can only be seen in the context of the body, that the cell in and of itself has no reality if it's outside the body. And so combining that with an understanding that God is an evolving God, putting those pieces together, Christina, helped me not only to understand that we are part of the evolution of consciousness, we are part of the evolution of God, of the source, of the whole, of the totality, that there is no shame in who we are as human beings because we were designed this way by an evolving God, and that our struggle to evolve is God's struggle to evolve. And that set me on this course of working toward the shift in the collective consciousness, always working to be an instrument of God in God's evolution, in shifting the collective. And immediately I understood, especially because my inner guidance told me so, there is no personal salvation, and that I should even give up wanting that and really be of service to the whole, because that's where my meaning lies, and that's where everybody's meaning lies. And so that you and Sienna and Elizabeth and everyone in this audience is really part of God in the process of evolution, that we should stop shaming ourselves for who we are and what we do and our weaknesses, but that on the other hand, we do need to take responsibility for our part, because if the skin cell does not act as the protector of the body will be an open wound.
That's beautiful.
So I would like to take this. Yes, thank you, Beth. I would like to take a few giant steps backwards, fall off a cliff, just get sucked back into the black hole and find ourselves in the ego. I really want to draw this information for our listeners because I think your understanding of the ego is so in-depth. Can we go back to chapter 1 of Living with Reality? Ego, instinct, and evolution. Are we ready to change? Why do we resist self-awareness and change? Just however your guidance wants to unfold this.
Thank you, Sienna. I think that that's a perfect next step from where we were. I know that many spiritual teachers teach about the ego. And when I had my spiritual awakening, God told me not to read any books or study with anyone. And God said that God wanted me to be a blank slate to write on. And therefore, some somewhat different, perhaps even radical ideas could come through me. Just like the idea that it is God that is evolving and that we are an aspect of that God. That God is not perfect, and so then how could we be? So the way that I was taught about the ego, and other spiritual teachers at the time were not talking about the ego. This was an era of, by the way, just for people to know, I did found a spiritual community in 1983. And so I have been able to work with people, and I started doing intuitive counseling in 1980. So I've had a chance to work with people on a very deep level around healing and community and how to change in a very practical way in real life, not just in theory. Yes. And what started to come to me as well, first of all, and I just like to throw this in just as a kind of a double whammy before I get into what you're asking, is in itself not individual, it is collective. And even though we can have an individual manifestation of ego, like, okay, there is Beth's ego and there's your ego and so on's ego. But it's like everything else, if we are all part of the oneness, it's all the ego that we are exemplifying, that we are manifesting, that we are the ego in action, so to speak. So I'd like to put that in some kind of perspective, because there is a lot of shame about having ego as well as a lot of denial. What I was taught, and when I say I was taught, because you see, I was a blank slate, and I only teach what I am being taught in the moment. When I'm being guided to say something, I say it, and to write it, I write it. It's not like I had the idea before I wrote it. It was that the ego came out of, I guess, what you would call God's Big Bang Theory, and it comes out of the myth of creation. And I love this story, and this story comes up in Living with Reality as well as in an earlier book, the Sacred Union, the Healing of God book, and which is about the healing of God, about the fragmentation from the ego, which is another book about the ego. And the way that it was presented to me as a myth is that we were all at one time part of the amorphous oneness, but that God could not experience herself, himself, itself as real because there was no contrast, because there is no experience without contrast. If there is only blue, there is nothing but blue, and so there is no shape, there is no form, because all you can see is the same color. So I understood that. I mean, that made sense to me. And so there was something within God's self, or the source. And I'm not attached to the word God, by the way. It's just the shortest way of talking about the intelligence of the universe, or the universal, whatever it is you want to call it, the totality of all being. And that God needed to fragment in order to have experience and evolution. If everything is perfect, and God told me this too once, God said to me after an earthquake, it said, it is through our faults that we evolve. Because if everything is perfect, there is no evolution. And that was an important, and going back to your question, Christina, that was an important part of what formed my thinking, is understanding that our faults and our flaws are built into us, because without them, there would be no evolution. Everything would be stagnant. Our universe is not meant to be stagnant. And so God, or the amorphous whole, fragmented in order for there to be experience and evolution. But at the moment of fragmentation, ego is born, because we immediately experience ourselves as individuals. And we are, just like that individual cell in the body, that skin cell that I was talking about, is an individual cell, even though it is made up of exactly the same stuff as every other cell of the body, and on some level of everything in the universe. And so we have the experience of individual existence, even though the cell does not really exist outside of the whole. That's the paradox, you see. And so ego grounds us in the reality of individual existence. And at the same time, it has blinded us to the reality of our oneness. And in our first stage of development as consciousness, after fragmentation, we got lost in the experience of our individuality and forgot our oneness. And yet there is something in us that tells us that we are one. There's that feeling that we have. There's that connection when we go out and we look at the stars and we feel like we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Or when we have spiritual experiences, when we feel ourselves as energy beings that cannot be separated because we're the drop of water in the stream. And where does this energy start and where does that energy end? You see what I'm saying? We have all had these experiences, but because we are sentient beings and we feel pain, we have nerve endings, we experience, first of all, our individual pain. It's like when we were in the womb, we were part of the mother's body, and everything that happened to the mother happened to us. All her thoughts and feelings we experienced. And I know this from having been an intuitive counselor for so long and going back into the womb with people, that as embryos, we're experiencing what's happening to our mothers and what's happening in our world. And the fact that we are all telepathic to some degree, we all feel one another's feelings. That experience is there. But when I am hungry, what do I notice? It's overwhelming, that feeling of I am hungry, I have to eat, I have to eat. You think about then that as we fragment it, each individual fragment becomes caught up in the identity of the individual and loses the connection to the whole. So it is with us as we are born into this world. We have this infantile consciousness that thinks only of ourselves, that as an infant, I only know that I am hungry. I do not simultaneously think that my mother is tired. I'm not capable at that stage of development of comprehending my relationship with others and the impact of my behavior on other people. You never ask an infant to not be hungry in order to spare the mother. And yet, in reality, in the way the real world works, if the mother is not rested and is not cared for and doesn't get the proper nutrition, she can't take care of the infant. So we already are in a dilemma, which is from our infancy, we have the consciousness of the individual fragmented from the whole. And yet at the same time, that infant exists within the context of a family for which that infant takes no responsibility, and nobody knows how to deal with that. And so very quickly, the infant who can only think, because without training, we only think from the ego. The ego is the instinct for survival for that infant. That infant is going to cry because it needs to cry. How else is it going to tell you that it's hungry? The ego has to tell you that you're cold and you need a sweater. The ego has to tell you that if you put your hand on that stove, you're going to burn yourself. Something needs to make you aware that you are not just part of the oneness. If you're part of the oneness, you can put your hand on that stove and feel nothing. But you're going to burn. So the ego is grounding, and it's necessary, and it helps keep us taking care of ourselves. But it's born in infancy. It has infantile consciousness, and it doesn't, typically speaking, get trained to be aware of others. And that's the world as we see it, because as that baby, that infant grows, it very quickly learns how to take care of itself as an individual. So that's why the chapter, it's actually an introduction, is called Ego, Instinct, and Evolution, is because our ego is tied with our survival instinct. It's built into us. The ego of everything, the ego of the snail, the ego of the dog, the ego of every aspect of consciousness, because the consciousness did not just fragment into humans It fragmented into everything, every star, every solar system, every thought, every aspect of consciousness, anything that is part of the whole that now exists as an individual has ego. Courage has ego. I am the best quality of consciousness that there is because without me, nothing could be done. You know what I'm saying? And so everything has ego. And each one of these egos is out for its own survival. And this is what we see, in fact, in the world. When the ant comes parading into my kitchen, it's not asking me whether eating my food is going to be for the highest good of all and whether it's going to be good for my health. And I simultaneously am going to get rid of that ant any way I can in order to protect myself, even though I may feel guilty about it. Because I can't have ants crawling in my bread and still be healthy. Because each one of us is driven by the motivation of our own survival. Now, fortunately, there is an evolutionary stage where we begin to think for the whole, whereas the infant will say, I'm hungry. I don't care if mommy hasn't slept in a week. I want, I need, gimme, gimme, gimme. At some point, that infant can grow in consciousness and say, you know, I'm hungry, but the last time I saw mom, she was about to collapse. Why don't I just stop crying for a while, give her a chance to sleep, and then she'll come over and feed me and she'll be happy to see me. I think I can tolerate this. Well, of course, the infant can't do that. But the more mature infant, which is what we are, the more mature version of that infant can do this. And that's how we start developing awareness. And in Platform 4 of Living with Reality, I talk about, you know, understanding the whole and how the whole works together and how we do what is for the highest good of all. But that is...
Beth. I want to back up into the nasty swamp that the ego is in. For example, you say here, one of your chapters is even called self-awareness can seem like a threat to our survival.
Yes.
You know, I would like to take it kind of step by step because we're dealing with a world where people are largely unconscious of their egos, that if one's ego is pointed out to one has to fight to the death to defend one's ego, that the world is polarized still into so many forces of the dark side. Like you always say, I quote you often on this, if you're in an ego state, you're lunch for the dark side. And I want to talk about that too. Yes. And I really want to portray, before we get into the transcending of the dilemma, which obviously is what we need to do, the real state we're in and why the ego right now is so resistant. There's so much stress, so much toxicity right now in our world. And shockingly, to those people who are becoming awake and aware, there's a tremendous still resistance to So I want to talk about how that can be, what the mechanism of the ego is in its resistive stage. And then another area that I think you're genius at is how to mature the ego step by step. I mean, I've seen you work in groups where you just see people's egos. Of course, we don't ever seem to see our ego, which is in a nice built-in mechanism to keep it going forever, and how we deal with that. So I want to take as to why self-awareness can seem like a threat to our survival.
Yeah, Sienna, you are reading my mind, because I was about to say now, but we have to go back to, I wanted to drop that little piece of hope in there because before we went back into the swamp and the morass, I am so, This is so critical. So having described, I hope in some way that it feels real to people, how the ego is born, then what does the clever ego do? Because the clever ego is there to help us survive. It has to figure out how to survive in a world of egos. And what the ego does is it tries to find its edge. Everybody has to figure out a survival strategy at a very early age. So the first survival strategy is to cry, right, when we're hungry. Now, let's say you have a mother who gets resentful and angry every time you cry, and your mother is the source in your life, right? God, so to speak.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? You're going to have to figure out some other survival strategy. So what you may learn is you may learn to coo and goo goo gaga, because maybe you have a mother who will respond better to cooing and goo goo and gaga. And so here's the irony. You say, oh, this is such a good baby, but it could be just that the baby has figured out that that's what the mother will respond to. Or the baby will give up on the mother and go to the grandmother. And the grandmother will go to the mother and say, you really ought to give Sienna the infant figures out who its allies are going to be and what its particular survival strategy is going to be. And we develop, and Sienna, this is so important, we develop personalities around the need for survival. We develop personalities around two things. One, what is our nature, what comes in with us genetically. Let's say I'm more aggressive, or I'm less aggressive, or whatever that is. So there's something in us genetically, but then simultaneously, we have to figure out how to survive within the context of where we live. And so that is the family, that is the society. Any culture that you live in is going to have rules of how everybody relates, and you're going to have to figure out how you're going to survive within that. So if you live in a society where you have to be polite, you are going to learn how to be polite. Either that or you're going to die. And so what happens, and you can see that by looking at, it's so interesting to watch people from different cultures, even if it's just the difference between being born in New York and being born in Ohio. What are the norms? That you get it. What are the norms in your family? Who has the power in your family to get the resources to you so you can survive? And you could turn into daddy's little girl, and you develop an entire personality around being daddy's little girl, or mama's favorite, mama's little helper. And you become if you're daddy's little girl, you're going to be maybe cute and sexy. And if you're mama's helper, you're going to be diligent and hardworking and helpful and all of this. So we develop these personalities, and depending on where you are in your family, you're going to have to figure something out. And so this is all, and having done counseling, I can see it. We've all seen this, that we're very much a product of our environment, but it's not exactly our environment. It's how we learn to survive in that environment. So here we have these personalities that have been developed from our infancy based on the accident of our genetics and the situation of our birth. What was going on in our families? What were our parents thinking and feeling? What were they going to respond to? And so these personalities that we have developed are the ego strategies for survival. And then we take these strategies into the larger world. We end up in the daycare center, or in kindergarten, or in first grade, or in college, or in a marriage. And we've got these patterns that we learned at a very young age that is very hard to change, because we don't even realize they exist. We think that they are us. We think that our survival strategy is who we are.
Yeah.
And so the first thing, as you said, is we don't even notice, because we are completely identified with the ego personality, and our ego has the purpose of our survival as individuals. When you threaten a pattern that you develop, that your ego developed for your survival, you will feel fear, and you don't even know it. You will be afraid to change, even if it's a dysfunctional pattern. In the book, I gave an example of a guy who's killing himself drinking. And why is he drinking? He's drinking because he doesn't want to tell the truth about what he's feeling, and so he suppresses it by drinking. Well, why doesn't he want to tell the truth? So you go back and you say, well, why? You go back into this boy's childhood and you understand why he was afraid to speak the truth. Because if you annoyed dad, dad was a lunatic, angry alcoholic, looks like a lunatic, right? Angry alcoholic, and he'll smack you, or he'll smack mom, or he'll do something. And so you get scared. So that boy has been trained from day one to fear, and he's afraid to express himself. So here he is, he's 45 years old, and he's drinking himself to death. So the survival strategy that he developed probably in the womb of shutting himself up and using any means possible to do so, now is killing him. But what happens when you try to confront that alcoholism? Well, he can't stop drinking, because if he stopped drinking, he'd start speaking. If he started speaking, then this old visceral fear comes out: I will not survive. This is the story of all of us in humanity. If you think of humanity as a whole, we are full of dysfunctional patterns. We as individuals, we as societies. I mean, if you look at the news today, you can see people are just how dysfunctional people are. If you look at your own self, at your neighbors, at your husbands, wives, lovers, children, look at the dysfunction. I don't just mean addictive behavior, of which we have a lot in terms of overeating or undereating or drinking or drugs or sex addiction or gambling or spending or TV or whatever addiction we happen to be in, but also when we're addicted to either being angry or being afraid or being all these patterns that we have gotten into, and the way we treat one another and the narrow self-centered vision that we have, all of this give me and protect me and protect myself no matter the cost. These are destroying us, and yet we are afraid to change because we are afraid to give up the survival mechanisms that we learned before we even knew the meaning of the word learning.
What would you say to a situation where, well, this is my situation, actually.
30 de septiembre, a todos los números
we lost
celulares de
Sienna.
Ecuador.
Anyways, well, I'm curious to my son, and I see this a lot with children, especially nowadays, and I don't know if there's a change in the children being born now, but he has this like super ego where it seems like a defiance, where his ego is so strong, he's so stubborn, and he just wants it his way. And we've been we're the kind of parents that really encourage individuality and talents and things like that. And we don't give in to this super demanding ego, yet, he's 13 now, and it doesn't matter that we don't give into it, it's still there. So what's going on there, and why do we see more of that, it seems, in children these days?
Well, it's so funny you asked me that, Christina, because, see, I'm from a different generation. I'm from a generation where when my mother raised her eyebrow, that was enough.
Yeah.
I was never hit by my parents, but you were expected to behave. And that's the way it was. There wasn't the permissiveness in the society that there is today. And I'm not saying that that was good either. I'm saying that was just another way that we coped, and different kinds of dysfunctions came out of that. But what you're describing is that as a culture and a society that has run amok with individualism, that we believe that we should be able to do anything we want because we've had the material wealth in order to be able to do it. I mean, there's so much more to say about how the ego develops. But here it is, simply that if you grew up in a poor society where everyone had to cooperate, so if you see what wealth does, is wealth gives liberty to the ego that poverty does not. Mm-hmm. In the broader picture of our world, we have had, even though what we have called the Great Recession has been very, very painful for many people, the level of poverty that we're talking about does not compare to the level of poverty that in general, and I'm not saying completely, of the Great Depression, for example. or the level of poverty of our grandparents who grew up in, in ghettos in Europe. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So the socialization that we received at that era and with less money demanded, even from an ego perspective, we had to figure out some way to get along or to do things collectively just in order to survive. Now, what happens when you think that your survival doesn't depend on that anymore? And you live in a society where you control so much of the input that you get. You can watch television or use your cell phone or go on the internet. When you have friends who support that same consciousness, that in order for you to fit in to your collective, you have to have qualities that the rest of your collective admires. Because, see, the ego's survival does not only depend on the parents, but there's another level of socialization about belonging to the tribe. And the tribe could be the gang, for instance. I mean, why would kids who have lived in the ghetto join a gang when they know damn well it's a one-way street to death or prison? Well, because that's where you find your safety, because the ego is always looking for safety, and it will find safety in the tribe. And what behaviors do you have to take on in order to have a sense of belonging in the tribe? So there are so many things that go just beyond you that have to do with your child and how your child is going to be. It is also very possible that you gave the child permission to be self-centered because you felt like that was the way to nurture that child's soul. I've seen in many people who are wanting to nurture their children, they don't want to discipline their children because the association of discipline, that we associated discipline with shutting people up, with suppression. That's what we saw in general as discipline is throwing someone in prison or shutting them up at the dinner table or smacking them when they did something wrong. So there is a negative association with discipline. When we get to platform 4 of the book and we start talking about the highest good of all, unless that child is taught to become conscious of others and their needs and begins to identify that ultimately their needs can only be met when everybody's needs are met, which nobody really believes, by the way. Deep down inside, our world does not operate on that basis. You know what I mean? It's mostly operating on the basis of number one, I've got to take care of number one. But unless you're able to teach that child a whole higher level of consciousness, then what you are giving that child in terms of nurturance and supporting their individuality is not being balanced out by that child's real deep understanding that their survival is really hooked into the survival of the whole or the well-being of the whole.
We'll be right back and break this down, the stages that the ego needs to go through to arrive at this place. This is absolutely brilliant. I'm very, very grateful for you on the call today, on the show, and we'll be right back, everyone, with Hour 2 of Shadowland Voyagers with Beth Green, Living with Reality.
Broadcasting worldwide in complete defiance of the U.S. Patriot Act and the NDAA.
This is the Truth Frequency Radio Network.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Sienna Leah. I'm here with Christina Grant and Elizabeth Hansen, and this is episode 22 with Beth Green. Beth, we were just breaking down the ego, and I do not want to interrupt your flow whatsoever. Let's just keep rolling with it. this immature ego that is out for itself. What do you say in your book? It's an ego-eat-ego world.
Yeah.
How do we get into this unity from the ego to ego world? Where do we leave off here?
Well, I have no idea where we left off because I don't have very linear thinking. But I think during the break, some questions came up that I think are very, very pertinent and probably is a perfect follow-through from where we left off, because we were talking about different ways that the ego develops and shows up and how it ends up becoming very dysfunctional. And I remember now why the ego is resistant to change. It's because it's afraid that we will not survive. And we have the same behavior, by the way. This was not what I was going to talk about, but I guess I am. On collective levels, nations think they need to be the most aggressive or the most this or the most that. Each nation has its own ego personality to try to find its way in the world and survive. And we see that as self-destructive as war is, and having a military-dominated economy, and how painful that is. The old guns and butters debate. Can we provide health care if we're putting it so much into war? And we see this throughout the world, not just in our own nation. That these are all dysfunctional behaviors, and they're all based on the collective ego of a society, or the collective ego of a race or a social group, each of which is trying to put forward an agenda. And even to the point that within our own nation, when we're trying to solve our problems, each group has its own agenda. As I mentioned earlier, I was very involved with the welfare movement. And I understand that we all, if you are a welfare recipient or a person who provides welfare, or everybody has a stake in the way the welfare system works. And we don't come together with an open heart and an open mind to say what is really going to support the highest good of all. We all come in with the fear and self-protectiveness that the ego always carries to try to dominate and say, this is the way it needs to be because that's what I want. That's what I need. It's the same thing. And that one thing that really disturbed me about the right to life abortion debate is that people who were defending abortion did not admit that there was killing, that a child is being killed. And at the same time, I support that there has to be abortion. But I'm supporting it without denying the truth of what the other one is saying. We all are part of the whole. We all have a perspective that we need to bring together. And when we can start bringing all those perspectives together and then deferring to higher consciousness, we can begin to solve some of our problems. But when we all come in with closed minds and defending our position as though it was truth, that isn't any different from Christina's son who says, I want to do it my way. It's just that when we're looking at a 13-year-old, it's very obvious to us. When we're looking at ourselves, it's very not obvious. And when we're looking at the collective in which we exist, we don't even notice it most of the time because the traditional ways of thinking are so embedded in our consciousness that we don't notice that they are ways of thinking. We just think of them as truth.
Exactly. Wow, and defend them till the end, blindly, and feel attacked and assaulted and unjustly pushed up against the wall. I remember in some of your seminars feeling that way because, as I was saying earlier, you call a spade a spade. I remember in one of the seminars you said to me, well, your thing was that you got to be the bad girl, and you're still working on that. You need to get over that. It's like, oh. It feels like somebody's, putting a sword through your heart. But then there's this incredible liberation. Now, there's, first of all, a disorientation, a wounding, a grief. But it's like breaking up something, just calling it what it is, a liberation from it. But it's, I really appreciate the courage you have in your work. And you have a great perception of people's egos. But people don't like to to get confronted on any of this. There's this huge taboo to even call a spade. And yet, how are we going to get over this if we aren't mature enough to look at this shadow aspect of ourselves straight on?
You're so right, because we all need, whatever it takes, the willingness to be guided to say the thing we know is going to make us unpopular. And or before the break, we were discussing the fact that we merge with a tribe in order to be safe, because again, our ego's first job is to protect us. And so merging with a tribe is the best way to be protected. And, being the lone coyote is a very dangerous thing. And so we are always unconsciously calibrating, what is the impact going to be if I say this? And I don't mean the my truth kind of thing, which you often hear people say, well, I have to say my truth, which is often just defensiveness, anger, and projection. I mean the truth, which is guided by source, where we listen to the source, and the source tells us, so-and-so is doing such and such, and you need to tell them, even if they hate you. And they do. And even if the negative energies are going to come at you, which they will. And it's so understandable, because I'm the same way. I am a human being, and I am that. I totally understand what defensiveness feels like. And I know that so much of it is based on shame. And in Ego, Instinct, and Evolution, we talk a lot about the shame of existence and how we feel so much shame because we've talked about the selfishness of the ego, but there's also shame associated with it, which is, I know damn well that I'm just going after myself, even though I'm pretending that I'm doing this for some higher or nobler purpose. I don't want anyone to know that, because then I'm going to feel ashamed of myself. People are going to know that I'm selfish, and they won't want to support me anymore. Because remember that survival is at the bottom of all egoic behavior, even if it's so many layers down in the unconscious mind that it's hard to even notice. And so when we feel shame, we feel that we're not going to be loved, we're not going to be wanted, and we aren't going to be supported, and then we are going to die. And that feeling that we have when we feel shame is, I wish I were dead. You know that feeling?
Oh, yeah.
It really taps into a primal fear that we are going to die because we have been disapproved of by our support system, and that therefore they're going to withdraw their support, and so on and so on. Then if you're in a family where looking selfish is considered to be, next to murder, then you're going to be shamed for having ego, and then you're going to spend the rest of your life being in your ego, trying to pretend that you're not. And so anybody who calls you on anything that shows you that you're in your ego is really going to, again, tap into that survival fear.
Wow, that really makes it a lockdown. Here we are in a society that's all about ego. Everyone's motivated by ego. And the big lie is that we all have to pretend together that none of us are. And if we call each other on it, we feel like our lives are being threatened. Good luck with that one.
Right. And if you're the messenger, good luck with that.
And if you're not the messenger, good luck with that.
Yeah. Either way, it's a lose-lose situation. Something came up in the break that I would like to get to, which is about spiritual ego. And I hear the drums roll. Those of us in the New Age movement or spiritual movement or New Thought movement or whatever it is, have an extra added dimension of ego that we must be cognizant of. And I'd like to preface this with an explanation of why we need to be cognizant of it. Not only is being dominated, and by the way, of course we can't get rid of ego, because in order to get rid of ego, we'd have to get rid of ourselves and everything else that exists. But that the ego needs to grow up. I call it the ego twice born, into the yes universe, where the ego has shifted and matured. But what I'd like to share, and I feel blocked already because it's not, all of a sudden it stopped flowing.
We're probably, showing you our resistance energetically.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing. now that we've had that information, I'd like you to shift into supporting me in saying this, because we need to look at spiritual ego on many levels. And the reason that it is so critical is that when we suffer from the domination of our spiritual ego, we are blocking the voice of God. We are blocking the source. If we already think we know what God thinks, or we have all kinds of pet theories, or we're trying to use spirituality for our own ends, we are not going to listen. If we do not listen, then we are losing the power of divine consciousness to help heal the planet. There are many ways in which this spiritual ego can show up. When I first became what I guess you could call a channel for higher consciousness, and I became intuitive, I thought I was hot shit and I could see into everybody, and I didn't know what to do with that. So naturally I got into my ego about it and felt that everybody needed to hear what I had to say, whether they wanted to hear it or not. And I got that. I got it. I got that was painful and wrong. And that's different from shrinking and not telling the truth when source tells me to. That's me using God to make myself look big. And we can use what we know or what we think we know to hurt people. Very often, what we think is an intuitive hit about somebody is a projection. And as I've mentioned to you, before the program, is that I have been doing intuition training and counselor training for decades, because we need to learn how to release the domination of our egos in order to be guided by source to truly help people, and not just use the opportunity in order to make a point about ourselves, in order to look important, in order to make friends, in order to get back at somebody, in order to act like we know something that we do not know. Typically, I find in counseling that human beings are extremely complicated, have many roots to every behavior, that there are no simple answers and there are no easy fixes. And when we're in that frame of humility, in the face of the magnitude of the problems on the individual and collective levels, and I haven't even talked about the biggest problem, which is that it is not just us, it is us collectively, because we are not individuals. So how do you fix one person? God gave it to me this way. He said, just try to clean the air over one house in Los Angeles. And so we have a tremendous, tremendous work to do to shift the collective consciousness, because we are part of it. And so to be completely on our knees, aware of the magnitude of the challenge, dedicated to being channels of divine consciousness to the degree that we can, requires us to overcome the domination of spiritual ego. And one of the most serious forms of spiritual ego is attempting to use spirituality for our egoic purposes. And much of our New Thought, New Age movement has done that. It's like, I want a great man, and this is what he's going to look like, and I'm going to use the universal laws in order to get this guy. And that's wrong, because that is coming from an egoic perspective, that there is an I, and that what I want is what should dominate the universe, and that I'm using God to do this. Now, what I have been taught is that we need to become the agents of divine consciousness. If God intends you to have some great guy, for example, then maybe God will tell you, why don't you join an online dating service But you didn't manifest that guy because you joined the online dating service. You allowed God to guide you to meet that man by you listening to God when God told you to join the online dating service. But God might just as easily tell you to join the online dating service because you needed the experience of seeing how reactive you still are around men. So every time we get divine guidance, it doesn't necessarily have to do with any agenda that we have. Like, oh, if I eat this food, I will be well, or I will lose 20 pounds. Or if I, pray night and day that I will manifest a parking space the next time that I go to Walmart. It's like, what does God want? What does the evolution of consciousness require? What is it because we are one? And what does the oneness require for the evolution of the oneness? We, each of us, are a part of that oneness. We have a piece of the collective karma, a piece of information that was imparted to me. And again, I can't even tell you that this is truth. I'm only telling you what I've been taught by my inner guides or wisdom or my connection to source, is that karma is collective because we are not individuals. We only look back at it. It would be like, oh, this is the individual karma of this cell, but that we have collective karma. And that each one of us is responsible for an aspect of the collective karma. That I could see myself having past lives, 5 past lives in the same year. Well, was I living in 5 parallel universes? No, it means that whatever that metaphor is, that past life represents, whatever that piece of stuck energy is that needs to move and be transmuted, to use your word, that needs evolution, I have responsibility for that. Not all the responsibility. I have my responsibility to move that piece of stuck energy. So let's say I have a lot of spiritual ego, that I want things to turn out my way, or that I want to look important because I'm connected to source, or whatever it is. Let's say I have spiritual ego. Even that isn't shameful. It may be evil, but it's not shameful because that's the way I was designed. And that is important. It's important for me to take this on. It is important for everyone. We're all suffering from ego, and why would it not show up in our spirituality? We need to take this on as part of the evolution of consciousness. That's our job.
So regarding surrendering agendas, how can one tell if their motive then is clean?
Let's assume that our motives aren't. You know what I mean? If it's our motives that they would tend to be personal. Okay. I think what we can do is we empty ourselves of motives when we ask for divine guidance. So that, for instance, I was trained, one of the first ways that I was trained when I first had my psychic awakening was to ask about what to eat at every meal or what to wear. Earlier in my life, I had experiences like I was guided to go walk down a street, and I got bitten by a dog on that street. And I said, God, what did you do? Why did you send me down this street? And God said, I literally, I had to go to the doctor. The dog bit me, and my clothes were ripped. And God said, well, the next time I tell you to do something, are you going to do it? I said, yes. He said, that's why you need to have these experiences, that I have no guarantee about what I consider to be a positive outcome, because in fact, we don't even know what is the positive outcome. Maybe I was meant to be bitten by that dog because the owner then found out the dog bit me, and the owner built a much higher fence. And maybe the next person who walked down the street who hadn't been me, if they had gotten bitten, they might have been more injured than I. How do I know even then what was the purpose of that experience? Mm-hmm. I just have to accept it. So you start with getting neutral. And I'm doing a program on the internet that you can access absolutely free through a magazine, a San Diego-based magazine. May I mention that?
Please.
Yes, absolutely.
It's called Life, Life, lifeconnectionmagazine.com. The Life Connection is a San Diego-based magazine. They have just gone with a whole new website, and on their first edition has 4 videos by me on how to lead a guided life. And the first one is the magic of the guided life, where I talk about it. The second one has community sharings. The third one is fear, ego, and God. Fear, ego, and the case for higher consciousness. And the fourth one is a ritual where I teach people to go blank. So those 4 videos are the beginning, the inauguration of the series. And there will be a series. And the next one, which we're taping this week and will come in the May issue, is going to teach people ways of getting neutral and checking in with source. It's not easy. It's very difficult. We have to constantly check ourselves, check our motives, learn how to get neutral. We use a check-in process where we go to others. We have support calls every day where people come together and check in together on things that they're supposed to do to make sure that they're not being dominated by some unconscious agenda. And awareness, self-awareness. Know ourselves, the more likely we are to catch when we are being dominated by some personal intention. What God told me as I started doing this guided life series is that what we really need to focus on is having no intention. And I know that flies in the face of what many people are taught, but the only intention that we should have is to have no intention of our own, but to become the instruments of divine intention. And that's not easy, but when you have a community that supports it, it's a lot easier to do it.
Yeah, it's wonderful because when you do that, you get into this flow with life. And that's sort of when the magic happens. Would you also call this, you've talked about the path of not knowing. Is this tied into that teaching?
Very much so. Very much. To recognize that we don't know anything, that everything we say is an opinion or a belief, and that beliefs, in fact, can be useful or detrimental, but neither true nor false. Instead of trying to get into that's true, that's not true, it's that this is a useful belief or this is a useless belief. And in the Living with Reality platform 8, I really developed the ideas, much more deeply. And going into the not knowing means we become available to divine consciousness, which is what it's all about. That we can become, and let me clarify something, because it's all divine consciousness. If I'm an angry asshole, that is divine consciousness too, because everything is God. Even the absence of God is God. Okay, that was part of what, Christina, I think you were the one who asked me in the beginning, how was I shifted by meeting God and having God tell me that God was changing? I came to understand that everything is God, including the absence of God. The rapist and the saint are all God. But at what level of integration? We talked about the fragmentation of consciousness and that the healing of God is about the integration of consciousness. And the more integrated our consciousness, the less out of balance we are. And in Platform 6, I talk about integrated, some steps towards becoming more and more integrated. The less dominated we are by any aspect of us, the more whole we are, the more we are able to access a higher level of divine consciousness. The more integrated levels of divine consciousness, which is what we are all needing and what we are all looking for. So we're connecting to the totality of God rather than a fragment of God. See, anger is an aspect of consciousness that has a purpose. That purpose is to bring our awareness to something. But we're not supposed to stay angry. Because then we become dominated by anger. It's the same thing with ego. The ego tells me that I'm cold or that I'm hungry or that I feel threatened or something like that. It becomes part of consciousness. The ego, when it is in balance, when it is integrated into the wholeness, becomes a valuable ally in consciousness. Because the ego can tell us that we are all killing ourselves, that we are destroying the climate, which is our mother, or part of that mothering energy that sustains us, the ego can help us to remind us that we should be asking for divine consciousness because we need it. The ego begins to understand that what we need is a higher level of consciousness, a greater perspective than we're capable of, and a greater wholeness than we are capable of by ourselves. The ego can learn this and can become our ally.
Yes, I love how you said that. It really can become our ally. I see it like that and that as well. And just that you just really hit the nail on the head when it's just really about consciousness and becoming more aware. I said it a lot. Awareness is key because that is how we become awakened to reality. And like you're saying, dysfunction and the ego speaking to us, and that's what brings into consciousness that which is unconscious. And that's the whole point here.
Right. I used to say we need to make the unconscious conscious and the conscious unconscious. That the things that we think consciously, we need to integrate into our unconscious so that we start behaving habitually and having different reaction responses. In the platform on self-awareness, we talk about stimulus, reaction, response. And it's great if we notice that we've had a bad response and we can make amends or try to correct. It's better if we can intervene between our reaction, which is the visceral reaction, and our response, so we may stop the destructive behavior before we've even done it. It's even better if we can intervene before the reaction, before that, when we reach that point of wholeness where we just don't get that angry or we don't feel that much fear. It takes a lot of wholeness and a lot of support and a lot of work and drudgery and self-awareness and good fortune to have the source shine on the smile on us when we can feel that way. And it is not linear. We don't make linear progress. It's very messy. But but it does exist. There is change.
Absolutely.
When I was working with you, you weren't involved in, I don't know what you're calling it now, the trance hypnotherapy. I would like to know the latest tools and integrative techniques that you are personally using with your clients to achieve what you just outlined. I don't know if you want to go there right now, but before the talk's done, we have about a half hour left.
I think this would be a perfect place to talk about this. As usual, Sienna, you're completely in alignment where we should go. I really appreciate it. And also, Christina, I love what you've been sharing. I had been working as an intuitive since 1980, an intuitive counselor, and I have trained people. But when James, my husband, came into my life about 2.5 years ago, he had been working as a hypnotherapist and doing transpersonal hypnotherapy is what he called it, because he was working with the higher self as well as with the unconscious. And he had also done trainings of people to become hypnotherapists. And we had a very interesting couple of years of trying to find ways of working together, because what we found in our individual work was that when called upon, let's say I was doing most of the counseling because that's my gift, he would give me the chi to help me keep going. But also when called upon, he would help put people in a relaxed state of consciousness, and he would use his hypnotherapeutic techniques, and I would use my intuition to guide people into deep places that help them to access deeper levels of their unconscious and do more thorough clearing. I might be able to see things when I'm doing a counseling session. It's just like, it sounds like therapy. It looks like therapy. I ask questions, I get it, but I say, no, that's not it, because I can feel that someone is off. Or I'll see something. I'll say, no, I see you're 5 years old and you're standing in a room and your hair is dirty or whatever. And then that person we can get back to that. But using the hypnotherapeutic relaxation techniques and regression techniques help certain clients, not all of them, because everybody responds differently to different techniques, to access the information more deeply themselves and be able to therefore affect deeper healing. Also, using a lot of chi energy that just comes through to help clear the person energetically so that they're clearing it emotionally, psychologically, and also energetically. So since we've started to work together, we do all of our work together. But also, and this is the most exciting part to me, is that I started to integrate some of those techniques into my intuitive counseling training. And because people have different capacities for being able to connect to intuition. And people really are by nature more or less intuitive, just like somebody might be more athletic than I am. I might be more intuitive than they are. That's just what we're born with. But everybody can develop whatever intuition they have. And what frustrated me is that when I would work with people and train them, I still found huge gaps in what they were able to do. They would work intuitively, feel whether, I taught people how to do this, how to feel the energy and the yes and no, but that they would get lost more often than I would have liked and did not get to the depth of healing that we were looking for. And when James came along and we started working together and we started to incorporate the hypnotherapeutic techniques into the training, the counselor was able to go into a deeper state of relaxation where they were more able to access more information from the unconscious mind of the client, so that the client was more relaxed and the counselor was more relaxed, and that opened the way for guidance, divine guidance, to come through more. So we have been working on that in the trainings in the last 2 years. This summer, for the first time, August 12th to 23rd, we are going to do a 2-week intensive here in Southern California in Bonsall. And it's going to be taped so that it can be available later to people who can't do it. And the first thing that people are going to be asked to do is read Living with Reality before they ever show up, and to watch 33 hours of videos that are not all made public about the platforms, where I elaborate on all the platforms so people have a deeper understanding of human behavior. In addition to that, then we're going to begin with a discussion of counseling. And people are going to understand a lot more about the counseling process than they might typically get from a hypnotherapeutic training, because we are training people to be counselors, not hypnotherapists. But they are intuitive hypnotherapists would be what their certification would be. And then we're going to be bringing in, how do you access guidance? Training people more to access guidance. And then we're going to have training on the basic, fundamental, foundational techniques of using hypnotherapy, inductions, relaxations, positive suggestions, and so on. And that's the 2-week intensive. And at the end of every day, people are going to practice. And I'm going to be able to do something that I haven't been able to do before, that James and I are going to be able to work with people in an accelerated, intensive, on the spot. I'll be able to supervise them on the spot, because in intuitive training, what has always been true is that when I have people practicing, I'm right there. And when I see the person is missing something really obvious about, or they're not asking the question the right way, or they've gone in the wrong direction, the question is why? Well, and this goes back to what Christina was asking, how do we get to that point of clarity? Well, we discover what blocked the person from picking up what it was that they needed to do. How did they miss that guidance? So we'll get to work with people on the spot. So we're going to see what happens. All that preparation before they get there, then those 2 weeks intensive, it's 100+ hour intensive. We're offering it for $1,200, and that doesn't include room and board, but we can help people find places to stay. And what we're going to be able to give them a certification, a certified hypnotherapist, and they'll have a certification in intuitive hypnotherapy. And what we have seen in the training in the last 2 years, because we've done some of this kind of training in our consciousness boot camp, is that people have been able to become so much more skilled, so much better at what they were already doing from the intuition training I've done. So much more able to do it that I'm excited. And it's an experiment like everything else that, God has guided us to try to do this because there is so much pain in the world. There is so much need for people who have different skills and people who already, let's say, know how to do breath work and bring it in, or people who can do massage, can do it in. We have a physical therapist who is going to be taking it, where we have people who are already a licensed therapist who can take it and will get, by the way, CEUs if you're an MFT or an LCSW, or RNs can take any of our programs and get CEUs. So people from different walks of life, and for all of us, I mean, it's good for self-healing. People are going to learn a lot about self-healing, but just to be able to use these powerful tools to help one another, that's what builds community. We at the Stream is our spiritual community. It's an amazing community. It's based on the principles of living and practices of living with reality. When you read the book, for those of you who have read it, there are tools, tons of tools about how to live a spiritual life in a very concrete way and how to overcome the ego's domination. And that one of the most important things that has emerged is the ability of the community to help one another, not just me, not just Helen, who's an excellent intuitive counselor, but everybody has been given the power to be of so much more support to one another, to learn how to help one another, to heal, to build a foundation of power and community, which then supports all of us. Another program that we have is Consciousness Boot Camp. And by the way, anyone who does the intuitive hypnotherapy intensive is eligible for a 25% discount on Consciousness Boot Camp, which is an 11-month program that we're going into the third year of, and you can take year 1, year 2, year 3, which includes the book, Living with Reality. And by the way, I didn't mention that James is preparing a hypnotherapy manual also for the hypnotherapy intensive. In Consciousness Bootcamp, we use the book, Living with Reality, in the first year. We do the lectures, and then we have these powerful collective healing experiences. And the people who move into the second year are mentoring the people in the first year, because that's really important. So we have second-year students, first-year students who come together on a one weekend a month. We're also, in the second year of Consciousness Bootcamp, people have been getting esoteric arts and science training. They're also getting healing arts. We use the arts to help not only the audience to heal, but the actors as well, to see where our blocks are. These are all healing modalities. And we are going to go into, and the second year we're using the Healing of God book also. In the third year, we haven't done yet, but it already looks like the focus of the third year is service. And more shifting as we live these new ways of being and we make these changes, we are able to shift more and more into service to ourselves, our community, and our planet.
Is there a way for people to access this if they couldn't come to your physical location? Any of these programs?
Absolutely. The Stream Spiritual Service is broadcast every month free via the Ustream. The Consciousness Bootcamp can be done, not only can it be done by video, it can be done live we have this technology, Google Hangout. It's not perfect, but it works, where we have students in Kansas City and in Phoenix, for example, who don't miss a beat because they join us for all the live stuff, the 2 days on the weekend. When you start CBC 1, you have 1 day on the weekend. CBC 2 is 2 days. And if you can't make it that time, you can always catch up by watching, a video. They can participate live. So Consciousness Bootcamp comes in 3 versions. One we call Consciousness Bootcamp Lite, which is just the book, some of the videos, and a study guide. And you can get all of that free of charge. by going to livingwithreality.com and just sign up for our mailing list, and you get this study guide and the book. And I mean, we want this information out, that's our purpose. The second level of Consciousness Bootcamp is Consciousness Bootcamp Full, we call it, where you do absolutely everything, but you do it all by pre-recorded video, and that's $100 a month. And Consciousness Bootcamp Live and in person, you actually get to be a part of, participate, ask questions. You see if you did it and there are ways of seeing videos of what we've done, so you get an idea of what it's like. And that's $200 a month or $300 a month for a family that lives together. People consider themselves a family and live in the same house. And again, that includes the free book. If you want the book in physical form, you have to buy it, because I have to buy it. It's from Amazon. You can get it at Amazon.com. So all of this is available. And we are going to be making the intuitive hypnotherapy training available later on pre-recorded form. But for our first one, we really are inviting our little flagship group to come and be here in person, if at all possible. People are, going to be flying in because it's much easier for people to participate when they're here in person, easier for them to be trained. And it's a 2-week period out of their lives, as opposed to having to fly down once a month for CBC, we have a woman in Portland who was trying to come down every other month and then do it via internet every other month. So we do our best. We also do women's retreats, men's retreats, all of which can be done via the internet, because we have our arms out. The information about our intuitive hypnotherapy training and consciousness bootcamp are all on the website centerforh.com. And that's A-N-D. www.centerforh.com. That's the Center for Healing and Higher Consciousness, which James and I co-founded. And that will also bring you links. You can find out about Consciousness Bootcamp there. Consciousness Bootcamp also has its own website, consciousnessbootcamp.org, that has a lot of information, has its learning center. The Stream has a website called thestream.org, and there you can find out way more about what's happening in the community. You can find out about how to watch monthly spiritual services. We have a free healing hour once a month where we have people chanting and doing, healing work. We have a sex and spirituality program also. All of these things, we try to make ourselves as accessible as possible. By the way, the Stream is a nonprofit corporation, and we are very open to, donations, because we do a tremendous amount of work. People are all volunteers, except James and I get paid for our counseling work or for the Consciousness Bootcamp, but we are an organization of volunteers. Our community lives on fumes. We have a beautiful center in Bonzo, a 3.11 acre sanctuary, and next to us is another 2 acres that's all connected because our executive director lives there. So we have 5 acres of gorgeous land with natural waterfalls and stream running right through the center of the property, all of which has to be paid for, needless to say.
Wow. What a tremendous amount of work you're doing. It sounds like an amazing place to go as well. What would you say does it take for a community or an organization and these programs? What does it take for it to be successful, and how does that tie in to humanity making a successful shift into the new era?
A great question, Christina, because it is the same process, whether you're in a family, in a community, or in the world. It is overcoming the domination of ego, which means overcoming our fear. And we learn in living with reality to shift our relationship to one another, to see our oneness. And in Platform 1, I even give habits, I think, I can't remember the number, of how to retrain our thinking. Then there are practices, and every platform has a series of self-help questions for us to examine. We even have Living with Reality free mutual support calls that anybody with a telephone can join. And it just keeps increasing our awareness. Then we as a community have adopted practices that we use in every situation. We have an amends process. We have release processes. We have how to release people, places, or things. We have how to get in balance processes and practices. These practices are what makes the difference. In our we have families in the stream with young children that are learning at 5 years old to ask questions like, is it for the highest good of all, including me, to eat candy at lunch? We have, and these children are learning about the ego, and they're learning the practices. They are developing that in their house, their homes, and it's not easy. It's always messy. We have developed it in the community. We are a thriving community in the sense that we do not have any factionalizing. We have always ways of coming back together because we all listen to the same source. Ultimately, we have to throw out all of our agendas and be guided by God. In the end, by the time you get to the end of Living with Reality, you're asking the question, would it most effectively unleash the power of the source for me to eat that candy at lunch? And of course, the answer is always no to that question. But we do food plans. We don't drink. We don't use drugs. We don't eat sugar, or at least, that's the goal. Not everybody is able to completely get off all of these things right away, but that's what we're committed to, because in order to be clear, we have to be clear vessels, and we have enough support to make it happen. And so that support in the community, even though we get on each other's nerves and we struggle and we don't have enough money and we're a bunch of nuts, we're all dysfunctional people. I love that. If it didn't work with dysfunctional people, who would it work for? Because who isn't? And when you take these same principles and you bring it to the larger world, the world could base itself on the 9 platforms. If we could adopt that, or something similar, it doesn't have to be my book, my way, my platform. This is a way that God spoke to me. In fact, I'd like to, before we close, I'd like to share just 2 minutes on the genesis of the Living with Reality book and program. It came in the middle of the night. I mean, literally. I've mentioned that I'm chronically ill and still am, and empowered by the source, and I should be dead. And but God told me that I was supposed to go out to the learning annex. This was 11 years ago, and give a talk on addictions, based on we had a multi-addiction recovery program at the time. It was like 2002, I think it was. So God told me that I should go do this thing. So I was going to someone was going to drive me to give this talk on our multi-addiction program. And I have a 12-step background. Many of us come out of 12-step backgrounds. And the night before, it was at 2:00 in the morning, I was awakened, literally awakened, and told to write down these words: Living with Reality, 9 platforms for becoming ourselves. And then I started writing down these platforms: becoming oneness, becoming differentiatedness. And I said to God, what is this? And God said, go to sleep. I'll tell you in the morning. And when I went to teach at the Learning Annex that day, I opened my mouth and I said, I'm going to teach you about the program called Living with Reality. And that program predated our community coming back together, because we had disbanded, and I had come back from Oregon, and I was living in Idlewild, and there wasn't really much happening, and I started writing this book, and as I was writing it, people were reading it, and as they were studying it, the community was forming. And it took me 9 years to write this book, and nothing has ever taken me 9 years. Normally a book comes out of me, once maybe I do a little editing, it's over. But not living with reality. It took 9 years of doing workshops and working with consciousness and fighting my way through the resistance and, writing through migraines and rewriting and having it grow and evolve until it became something that was really ready to be put out. And by that time, the community had been using the book for years, and I knew it worked. Yet it had been started in the middle of the night when I didn't even know that there was going to be a community that needed this, much less what it was.
Wow, that's incredible. I think we have about 3 minutes left. So, Beth, if you have anything that God would like to tell us right now, we would love to hear it. And I have to thank you so much for who you are, what you've gone through, what you're bringing to the world. Chronically ill with no energy is like got me up against the wall with how much energy comes through you. It's absolutely astounding, and you are absolutely astounding. Love you very much, and I'm just very grateful that you're here, and I feel that this work could have a huge impact on consciousness. I hope it is spread far and wide.
Oh, thank you. Well, first, I would like to thank you, Sienna, so much, and Christina and Elizabeth for being so gracious and so open. This was easy because there was so little resistance. It's the resistance that makes life tough, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, especially fighting it.
Please encourage people to go to the Center for H&H.com and thestream.org and check us out. We are open. We are truly open to anybody who really wants to take it on. We are looking for our relations, and we know we need to come together because it is so difficult for us to confront ourselves by ourselves. We need one another. We are one another. And I would like to, close with that God, the source, higher consciousness, Buddha consciousness, the great spirit, the higher power, whatever you want to call it, needs us. We are all aspects of that divine consciousness. We are the hands and feet of God. God can do nothing without us, and we can do nothing without God. God is our inspiration and our guide, and we are the God that is our inspiration and our guide. As God said to me early in the 1980s, Beth, God is no further from you than the nose on your face, because God is the nose on your face. God is calling upon us to overcome our shame and our feeling unworthy, and realize that how we are is all part of the divine plan in the process of evolution. And that instead of carrying shame, we need to take full responsibility, ask for divine guidance, look for help from one another, listen for God in all of us, and have faith in what we can do together.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's been wonderful connecting with you. You are a bright and shining star.
Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart.
Thank you so much, Beth.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. I really enjoyed all that you had to share, and the topics that we talked about were quite poignant, especially in these times when it seems like so many of us are being guided to really clear up all the destructive habitual behaviors.
Yes. Yes. It's either within us to do it or we're not going to be able to. And I would rather believe that it's within us, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I do think it's a choice to surrender.
Yes.
All right. Thank you again. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all country.